All right, so my name is Natalia, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Turku, but I'm also in a full-time job at the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control, affiliated with the UN, abbreviated HEUNI. And I'm going to present the outline of my PhD research. I was maybe a bit over-optimistic when I submitted my abstract in May, thinking I would now have all the synthesis of my thesis ready, which I don't, but I'm kind of still trying to put some pieces together and linking kind of the research that I've been doing over the course of my PhD. So my PhD focuses on trafficking in persons specifically and solely for the purpose of forced labor and related exploitation of migrant workers. So I'm not looking at all at the sexual exploitation in trafficking. I've kind of left that outside of the scope of my research. And I'm specifically interested in the emergence and the definition of trafficking for forced labor. What does this definition mean and how did it emerge? And then how trafficking for forced labor manifests itself, especially in contemporary Europe, more specifically in Finland. And then in the context of the regular labor markets, not really kind of illegal or kind of the black labor market. And then I'm interested also in the problems of interpretation and understanding the definition of trafficking and how this leads to problems in controlling trafficking because of the complex definition. So just to set the scene, at HEUNI, I, together with my colleagues, Minna being one of them, we've done research on trafficking for labor exploitation or trafficking for the purposes of forced labor since 2009 in the context of specifically 2 EU-funded projects. And in this research, we've been looking at, or we've been treating exploitation as a continuum, following Beate Andres and others have also written on this, on the idea of exploitation ranging from less severe exploitation to more severe exploitation, with trafficking and forced labor being at the more severe end. But we also see trafficking, or I see trafficking taking place in the context of overall exploitation of migrant labor. So I don't see it as treated as a separate phenomenon. And then in our previous research, we've also been highlighting that it's not very useful to only look at kind of extreme forms of violence or force, but also on the kind of those elements that kind of subtler forms of control that make workers dependent on their employers. I've published so far 3 articles focusing on different aspects of my thesis, and I'm currently working on my 4th article, which I hope to finish soon, which is looking at migrant workers and the consequences of neoliberal labor market conditions and how all of this creates kind of a breeding ground for exploitation and eventually trafficking. Earlier this year, I published an article looking at the definitions of forced labor in the ILO conventions and the Palermo Protocol, or the Palermo Protocol on trafficking, which our boss is very keen to always point out that it's not the Palermo Protocol because that's 3 of them. It's the Protocol on trafficking. So I've looked at that, the definition there, and how the definition of forced labor and trafficking kind of merge. And then I've also been looking at migrant labor and its exploitation in Finnish governmental policies, how labor policies, migration policies, and crime prevention policies, and overall governmental policies don't really meet on the issue of trafficking. So just very briefly, I've used different sources of data and information in my articles, one being these policy documents that I just mentioned, and also, as I mentioned already, the UN and the ILO treaty documents. I've looked at the negotiations, kind of done a bit of a historical analysis of those negotiations. And then I've used the interviews that we've done in the context of our previous projects, specifically those with migrant workers and those who have been kind of formally defined as victims of labor trafficking, and also with different experts, law enforcement, employers, prosecutors, trade unions, different labor actors, and so forth. So my preliminary findings covered 3 main key themes. My first one is that there's this I see that trafficking and exploitation of migrant workers can be kind of understood as a result of neoliberal policies, especially economic policies, that then affect the labor markets in ways that are not so positive, especially to those who are the most vulnerable. My second point is that I think there's a failure to recognize and define exploitation of migrant workers as trafficking. And now I want to highlight that it's specifically the most serious forms of exploitation, that there's kind of a problem to see this continuum. And I also think there's a failure to see exploited migrants as victims of crime in general, and thus as victims of trafficking, especially in the context of kind of a corporate crime analysis, which is something that I'm still kind of working on, what exactly I think about the issue of corporate crime. So just to go to some of my findings, in my current article that I'm working on, I'm kind of linking what I call neoliberal globalization to trafficking. And I'm looking at specifically forms of kind of the effects of what I think neoliberal globalization and the resulting competition in the labor market has led to. For instance, long subcontracting chains, very disadvantageous labor contracts, which then kind of these structural changes have affected especially the low-paid, low-level work, such as cleaning work, which is the case study that I'm having in my current article. And as I already mentioned, I think these changes affect the workforce and disproportionately, especially those who are most vulnerable and who have the least options and alternatives, who are then often migrants. Of course, also others are affected, but I'm looking at especially migrants. And I think it's the problem. The problem is that many of them, and now I'm generalizing, but many of them do not have a bargaining position and who might not be able to organize or unionize and therefore are even more vulnerable. And I think especially the demands for labor flexibility, which is kind of hailed as a necessity and a positive thing, especially on the employer's side. But then in terms of the workers, I think it's led to labor market practices that at worst facilitate labor exploitation and then again linking ultimately to trafficking. And I think one important point is that the exploitation of migrant labor, I don't think it's only an act of kind of bad criminal employers, but rather I think it can be seen as a structural practice which is directly linked to changes in the labor market, also the economy and to migration policies. So it's not necessarily only the kind of intentional exploitation of vulnerable workers, but also exploitation which is made possible through kind of the normal, legal, regular practices of the labor market. Then the second theme is the problem of control. And control authorities, I think, which is also something that was Mailen yesterday talked about, that control authorities have difficulties in grasping and identifying and tackling exploitation of migrant labor and trafficking. And as I show in one of my articles, the historical and complex definition of trafficking for forced labor stemming from the ILO 1930 Convention on Forced Labor, which was developed in a completely different historical setting and a historical context for a completely different purpose. And then the Palermo trafficking protocol definition, which focuses on forced labor, transnational organized crime, with forced labor added as a kind of an additional element, makes this definition rather complex. And then ultimately trafficking becomes reduced to stereotypes of, as I already mentioned, extreme violence, being organized by organized criminal groups, being linked to illegal immigration, and then as something that doesn't really affect our societies, and more specifically Finland. And then another point is also the difficulty of linking, as I already mentioned, my exploitation of migrant workers and trafficking. And this now then ties into larger debates on migration. That on one hand, there's this discourse that we need migrant workers as labor. But then on the other hand, we want to keep all the illegal and unwanted migrants outside, which is a kind of a big group. And then this big discussion, which I know is ongoing in the trafficking arena, this protection of some victims of trafficking while protecting the borders from those who are not defined as ideal and deserving victims and who are kind of unwanted migrants or maybe even members or parts of organized crime. So it becomes a very kind of complex issue. And I think this issue of the exploitation of migrant labor specifically kind of drowns in all of this debate. And then I have this concept of corporate crime, which I'm still thinking about, how I link it up to this whole debate. where I find in one of the articles that there is a general unwillingness to enforce the crimes of employers against especially migrant employees. And I also think there might be kind of an ethnic issue as well, that there's a tendency, at least in Finland, to enforce the crimes of ethnic employers against ethnic employees, and not that much of kind of Finnish employers against other employees. So instead, in the context of economic crime prevention and economic crime control, crimes of employers are seen as economic crimes. So it's kind of a crime against the state and the markets. So it's kind of a taxation violations, a problem of fair competition and of functioning markets. So in this context, the labor violations against migrant workers become kind of crimes against the states and markets, and they're not seen as victims of crime who might be in need of protection. And then just some conclusions. As I said, there is this complex historical definition of forced labor, which seems to be difficult to interpret in contemporary settings. There's been notions that it kind of forced labor is seen as something so kind of rare and serious and kind of other, something that only happens elsewhere, that it can't really happen in our societies. But there's been a recent change, I think, in law enforcement and also among prosecutors in kind of starting to interpret the concept of forced labor in the context of trafficking, seeing also the more subtler forms of control, not only the most serious examples of violence and threats. And then I see that there's these government policies that kind of disregard the transgressions of the rights of exploited individuals and instead focus on the rights of states. And as I mentioned already, there's also a failure to see labor violations as crimes violating individuals. And then what I think is really interesting now in my current article to kind of see how these normal and regular and legal labor market practices, especially promoting flexibility, and flexibility, I mean flexibility for the workforce, for the workers, seems to disproportionately affect those who are the most vulnerable, those who don't have a say and who don't have other options than to take any work on poor terms, and thus creating then conditions for exploitation and then ultimately for trafficking, so kind of linking the exploitation through the continuum to trafficking. And then I think as a kind of solution, I don't know if it's a solution, but I think there's a need to kind of bring these different silos of kind of crime prevention, of migration control, of labor policies, and of course of anti-trafficking policies together to try to address this as a whole. And I can't believe it, I've finished in 13 minutes and 50 seconds or something like that. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time.
Yes, great.
Yes. Thank you very much. I have several questions that I will throw myself. I'm interested in the whole construction of exploitation of forced labor, which indicate a higher threshold than exploitation for prostitution. The fact that it is kind of a double force, double exploitation involved. Is the Finnish translation very close to that formulation? In Norway it's tvangsarbeid.
Yeah, it's the same in Finland, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which really get people thinking about slavery.
Yeah.
A very extreme forms of force, which I think is the problem in Norway. So it seems much more difficult to prosecute than for prostitution. That's the one thing. Why this? I know the history of it, but why isn't? I'm interested in why that issue is not dealt with, and this double exploited, double force formulation is not seen as a hindrance, and then done something about politically. That's the one thing. And in the second, it's also the kind of organizational dealing with it, the kind of different control regimes. One, in the case of Norway, which I of course know best, there is also a lack of interest in approaching labor exploitation as trafficking. And it's mandated, it's managed by a whole separate control regime, that of labor. So the police rarely get involved. And police are used to looking for victims, but labor inspectors are not in the same way. So the whole separate system, the separate control systems is also a hindrance to identification of victims in the Norwegian case, I think. So these two major institutional formulation of the law and the structure of the control makes it almost impossible to prosecute labor exploitation in Norway. Yeah.
Okay,
Just
thank you.
on
Oh, thanks very much. I think your first point was really interesting, this difficulty to kind of prosecute forced labor. And I agree, there's a problem with the definition of trafficking for the purpose of forced labor, because in a way the elements of trafficking, the way it's defined in the Palermo Trafficking Protocol, and how forced labor is defined in the ILO Convention from 1930, they overlap in many respects. So I think there's the problem, first of all, that do you have to kind of have double, in a way, evidence for both elements, or can you just treat them somehow as the same? And I think in Finland there's been some discussion around this, and the criminal law was changed in this respect. And now I'm not sure what the exact terminology is in English. Maybe Minna can help me if I make a mistake. But the law previously said that it's exploitation for the purpose of forced labor and other inhumane conditions. And now it was switched around. So now the law says for the purpose of exploitation in something in inhumane conditions, comma, such as forced labor. Something like this. I'm not exactly now sure about the correct terminology, but basically it was switched around. So the focus is now on kind of the inhumane conditions in which the person was exploited, not specifically and only forced labor. So forced labor is kind of a subset now of inhumane conditions.
What's the content of the term inhumane labor?
Inhumane conditions. Well, that's then of course difficult to, what does it include? But I have to say that I think in Finland now I'm kind of promoting our work that we've been doing. But I do think that the research that we've done, or the reports that we've done on trafficking for forced labor, have kind of opened up the concept of exploitation to show that there's not a need to only see kind of the extreme elements of forced labor, which the definition kind of gives you the idea that it should be tvångsarbete, that it should be like really, as one of the informants that we had said, that it's kind of like, with a, like a gun to your head in a quarry, in a mine, picking stones or whatever. So it doesn't have to be that it can be much more subtler. And I think as a result of this debate that we've had, thanks to our report, and also a big thanks goes to the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Human Beings and her staff, in kind of raising the issues around exploitation of migrant labor and linking it up to the definition of the position of a vulnerability and dependency in the trafficking definition, kind of opening up those, what does it mean, and what are the examples of dependency, of indebtedness, of control, and so forth. That this actually amounts to trafficking, and it does amount to forced labor as well. So I think there's been a big debate around this, which has kind of opened it up and kind of made it less stereotypical and less serious. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but then the other point, which I think is really interesting in the Finnish context, is that we actually have the opposite. That in Finland it's much more difficult to get prosecutions for prostitution, because it's not seen as trafficking, even though there are kind of serious elements involved, and there's an overlap of pimping and trafficking, whereas there's a tendency to prosecute for pimping rather than for trafficking, which of course puts the position of the victim, it becomes very different. It becomes a victim versus a witness. And that's also where the National Rapporteur's Office has been doing a lot of work in trying to highlight this, that they're really, so I would say that in Finland this is a much more serious problem, that there is a slow kind of awakening to the problem of exploitation of migrant workers, and that linking up to trafficking. We have several convictions now actually. So there's kind of the momentum is kind of growing, and there are examples from like this case law basically in Finland. Which means that it's always easier than to prosecute the next case, which is very interesting. But then these control regimes, I agree, we have an interesting problem in Finland with the labor inspectorate, where labor inspectors do not, there is finally an official recognition that they should also be looking out for trafficking victims, but in practice, they don't, because it's not included as one of the crimes on which they have a mandate, even though they have an instruction that, if you suspect serious exploitation of a migrant worker, that it might amount to trafficking and you should act. but kind of formally trafficking is not one of the crimes on which they have a mandate. So it kind of depends on the individual kind of willingness and interest of the labor inspector to deal with those cases. We have some really good labor inspectors who've been on the front line in raising trafficking for forced labor as an issue in Finland, who've uncovered several cases. But it kind of, there's a problem of a systematic, I think, approach, especially on the labor side. So I kind of agree, but I think you have a much more kind of a streamlined and efficient system of identifying victims of sexual exploitation in Norway than we have in Finland. So again, I think the problem in Finland lies more on the sexual exploitation side rather than on the labor exploitation side, even though I think there are a lot of problems, of course, there as well. And there is this tendency not to really see the exploitation as a crime against the workers, the individuals, and then linking up to trafficking.
Any other comments? Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, this is
in Norway, I think something that makes it difficult is also how the parties in the unions and the employee union, the parties in the labor market, the negotiating parties, are very skeptical towards the fact we have the social dumping.
Yeah, I was going to say you have the dumping.
Sufficient.
Yeah.
Which has no victim in it. Not the state, the market, the Norwegian worker is the victim, and not the migrant labor, for example. But so there's been very great resistance. So they say, "Oh, is that really necessary?"
Yeah.
So they really don't want it, and they find it kind of stigmatizing the Norwegian labor market. And also in Norway, the action plans has only spoken of labor exploitation outside of Norway. So giving money to ILO, not having national things going on. So this very great, seeing kind of great need to see Norway as the kind of country where that doesn't take place. We have a great labor market. We're not that kind of people. Has seemed so important. But prostitution that was already stigmatized and otherized, you can kind of sacrifice and say, yes, it's horrible how Norwegian men contribute to this. So it was already outside. But the labor market is very much the core of Norwegian society, and not very difficult to be willing to pick at structural, organizational, but also criminal problematics in that.
Maybe can I just add, and you can answer, like, does this relate to the kind of a national imaginaries of Nordic countries being equal, and we have this equality between genders and working labor markets and equal labor markets, and we have this idea, and therefore it's difficult to understand that we might have some exploitation there as well.
But it's interesting if prostitution is encompassed in that identity somehow and not being problematized in the same way in Finland as in Norway. That really problematized exploitation in prostitution is not as straightforward in Finland as in Norway. But I'm not going to talk about it. So I'm not going to
Yeah, no, I think there's also this skepticism, especially among the employers' side in Finland, not so much among the labor unions, who actually have now for some years been quite active, not all of them, but some of them, in this issue. But I think with the employers' unions, they of course say that, well, it doesn't happen among our membership. It's unorganized employers, it's the ethnic employers, it's somebody else, it's not us. But what I think is important to see, and what I'm trying to show now in this one article of mine, is that I do think that this is linked to the structural changes in the labor market and the way it kind of demands flexibility, especially, but then also other things, of course, of employers, and it kind of disproportionately affects those who don't have a say. And then again, this is a completely different side note, but I do think that these huge changes that we're seeing in the world today of the refugee and the migration crisis, or whatever you want to call it, and the economic crisis will change maybe fundamentally, also this aspect. That we will probably see an even more dualized or trialized or whatever labor market than we've had until now.
It was also interesting what you were talking about, your own role and the role of your research as being kind of an activist in raising the awareness of this phenomenon, and it has had really, or you think that it has had impact in broadening
I think so. Well, I wouldn't say I'm an activist, but well, we were considering to found an NGO or something to assist migrant workers, but we didn't because there's no such NGO in Finland. But yeah, I do think it has, I mean, I don't want to kind of overemphasize the role of the research, but I do think it's been important in raising the discussion. It's kind of given, you know, evidence for the discussion. But I again think that together with the role of the National Rapporteur on Trafficking and her staff, you know, it's kind of, I think that's where the kind of the political pressure has come from there. They've been able to mobilize the information also for political kind of changes. But I do think it's been an important aspect. And I think without our research, it probably, you know, there would be much less, I mean, there would be less awareness. And I think that's where Norway kind of, because I know Synnøve did the kind of mapping of labor exploitation and trafficking in Norway. So I think there's kind of, you know, it's kind of a couple of years behind the development in Finland, that we did that some years ago, and now we kind of see that there's been a political shift. But again, I think with these current changes, I think the priorities will be completely elsewhere because of economy, because of migration, because of all these things.
Some other comments? Or advice for the construction?
Yes.
For the final article.
Any advice? Corporate crime, please. I'm going to go to the next session on corporate crime. Anything else?
Yeah, you have a really many multifaceted concepts and discussions that you should, or you are going to take on board in the final article. And there are corporate crime and these concepts, how you make your own framework. That's a challenge, but I think it takes time, but I think it will come.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
So, if anyone doesn't want to say anything, we thank Natalia
Thank you
for an interesting presentation.